You're watching Fugitive Red Eye, and today I'm going to be talking about my unpopular horror opinions. And it's in no particular order. So let's just kind of go. This is going to probably be a little bit rambly, but let's go. So the first kind of unpopular opinion I wanted to talk about today, as far as some horror stuff, is the movie It Follows, I think is greatly overrated. I don't think it's very good. And I've never understood why people act like it's this masterpiece in, like, atmospheric build-up in horror, when I remember when I watched it, I just thought it was kind of fucking goofy and stupid. So the premise is, this monster chases you around and tries to kill you, presumably, and you'll die if it gets you. The way it works is, if you have sex with someone, it'll go after them instead. So basically, I feel like it's supposed to be a commentary on STDs and maybe unplanned pregnancy, things like that. But it's just kind of stupid. I've never understood why people found it so creepy. I mean, yes, they never really show the monster or anything, so a lot of people are like, oh, it's that mystery, it's the fear of the unknown. It's like, don't get me wrong, I love fear of the unknown, I love H.P. Lovecraft, and I love a lot of atmospheric horror, but I just don't feel like this is the masterpiece everyone holds it up to be. Like, everyone acts like it's like the best modern horror movie ever in the last few years. So many reviewers I've seen online have praised the shit out of this movie, and I just can't take it seriously. It's such a stupid premise. I remember I was talking to Corbin about this, and he brought up it would have been better if they'd actually made it about an actual STD and had it be like really fucked up body horror. And I kind of agree, that actually probably would have been better. So, yeah, I don't think It Follows is anywhere near as good as everyone makes it out to be. I just think it's kind of generic. Like, everyone acts like, oh, it's so unique and original, and I mean, I guess in some respects the concept's sort of original. I mean, it is the only movie I can say where if you fuck someone, you pass the monster on to them. I'll give you that. But to me, original doesn't equal good, and I just frankly didn't enjoy it. So yeah, I don't really think It Follows is anywhere near as good as everyone makes it out to be. Alright, now the second opinion. This one's in a similar vein. And, it's kind of going to be weird, because this opinion is both popular and unpopular, I think, at the same time. Because I've heard people agree with me, and the people who disagree with me on this are actually kind of a newer thing. And that's that, Halloween 3 Season of the Witch is fucking boring. I can't stand that movie. Like, everyone acts like the only reason people don't like it is because it doesn't have Michael Myers in it. And I just frankly didn't enjoy it at all. Like, there were elements I got a laugh out of here and there. And, you know, I'm willing to give it another shot. I do own it on DVD. I might give it another watch and see if I can have some ironic fun out of it, which is what I was going into in the first place. I wanted to have some ironic fun in it, but it was so slow and boring, and it dragged on. And the plot's fucking stupid, too, which, granted, I was hoping it would be even stupider and be more fun. But Halloween 3 Season of the Witch, it's like these robots using witchcraft to make these masks that if kids wear while they're watching a commercial will just kill them. And I think it's ballsy they were just going to straight up show the kids dying in the movie. So I do think that's pretty cool that they did that. Because a lot of horror movies shy away from the death of children. So I will give it that, and I did get a few laughs out of it here and there. But ultimately, I just found it kind of slow and boring for most of the movie. There was only one or two parts that I genuinely thought were funny, ironically. And there wasn't anything that I genuinely felt was, like, actually good about it, other than perhaps the aesthetic. I do think that the Halloween aesthetic in this movie is pretty good. It definitely feels Halloween-y. You can feel the spirit of the season. But other than that, and a couple of laughs, I didn't get a whole hell of a lot out of that movie. Alright, moving on to number 3, and this one's kind of a hard one to explain, and I don't even know if this is unpopular, but let's get into it. Horror is a very difficult genre to explain or define, because I don't think that a lot of movies people consider to be horror are horror, and there are plenty of movies that aren't considered horror that I do consider horror. So for instance, let's say for example Alien, the first one. I think that's very clearly a psychological and maybe even cosmic horror to some extent. Maybe not on a grand scale, but it definitely has elements of it, and I think it's great. It is a sci-fi horror. But then you get movies that are just really over the top and gory. Like, for instance, best example I can think of in this case is Ichi the Killer. I don't see how anyone can view Ichi the Killer as horror. It's just really over the top violent. And I guess it's horrific with the violence, but I just don't see how anyone could view Ichi the Killer, either the manga or the movie, as a horror. I've always just seen it as like an interesting crime, violent thing. So, I don't know. Horror is a hard thing for me to define. I think that it's a tough thing to define exactly what is a horror. And I think that's true with a lot of genres, to be fair. Like, what constitutes a sitcom? You know, what separates a sitcom from something similar to a sitcom that isn't? Like, For instance, is the US version of Wilfred a sitcom? I would argue it's invariably true that the Australian version is, but is the American version? I think so, but it's also kind of got elements of dramedy and a few other things in it, and some suspense and action too. So horror, I run into a lot of the same things, because to me horror is something that should like scare you or creep you out, right? But maybe I just overthink it with that. Like, for instance, Cannibal Holocaust, I could see maybe an argument to be made for being horror because, you know, the stakes, you know, of the bad things happening to the people, but it's like, at the end of it, you're rooting for the film crew to get attacked because of how shitty they've been the entire movie to the cannibals. So it's like, I've never really considered that one a horror movie either, but it's often considered to be a horror movie. I don't know, it's just very hard for me to define horror. So that's something I run into a lot with problems. And the same thing with anime, too. Like, is Elfen Lied a horror anime? I don't know. It's violent, but would I call it horror? Maybe. I don't know. Horror is just a hard thing to define, so I don't know if that's a controversial opinion, but there it is. Alright, on to the next opinion. Seriousness in horror, right? While I do think there are plenty of excellent horror movies that are serious, that are fucking fantastic, like, for instance, John Carpenter's The Thing. I love that movie. It's one of my favorite all-time movies. Super creepy, atmospheric, great atmosphere and build-up. It's very creepy. That's great. I love that kind of serious horror movie. But in all honesty, in a lot of cases, I prefer a horror movie that just doesn't take itself too seriously. I don't mind horror movies being a little cheesy, over-the-top, and campy. That's fun. I don't know that this is necessarily a controversial or unpopular opinion, but I definitely do think it is one that maybe could be divisive. I think a lot of people might not like some of the over-the-top goofy series, you know, like Friday the 13th's later movies. I love Jason X. I think it's so stupid, but I absolutely love it. So, I don't know, there could be a lot of things, like, it could just be a matter of personal taste. I do think a lot of people do like those movies, but I do think that it could be divisive. I don't know how unpopular that is. But pretty simple one. Let's move on to the next opinion. I absolutely love the Saw sequels. That's not including Spiral, because number one, I haven't seen Spiral, and number two, what I know about Spiral, I don't think I'd like it. I've heard a lot of contrivances and stupid stuff about it. But I do like the other Saw sequels, all of them, to varying degrees, obviously. And in all honesty, I think a lot of them are at least interesting enough to be on par with the original movie. But yeah, the Saw movies are fun. They're good. They're pretty suspenseful with some of the traps, but they also are an interesting crime drama character series for me. So I've always enjoyed them. Next opinion. Now this one's going to be one that I think is probably one of the more controversial ones here. The Halloween remake is better than the original John Carpenter's Halloween. And obviously I'm not talking in how well constructed it is and things like that. I just think that it's a much more enjoyable movie. I think the Halloween remake from 2007 is fucking great. I loved the backstory to Michael Myers. I know a lot of people don't, because they're like, Michael Myers didn't need a backstory. This is just weird and contrived, and it's just Rob Zombie putting his style into it, but I really liked it. Like, a lot of people think it takes away some of the mystique of Michael Myers, and I just don't see how, because, I mean, he goes silent for decades, and I think that still builds up the mystique around him. You don't really know what's going on in his head. I don't think it's perfect. I think some of the dialogue is kind of stupid, especially from the teenage girls in the, you know, like Laurie and her friends. I think that that's kind of dumb. But I do think that overall I enjoy it the most out of any of the Halloween movies. The Halloween remake is my favorite one. Although I do also really like Halloween 2018. And I do like the original as well, but in all honesty, I'm not the biggest fan of the original compared to some of the sequels, and I know that's probably controversial too. To be fair, Halloween has never been my favorite slasher franchise. I've always been much more into Nightmare on Elm Street, and also into Friday the 13th. But I do still like the Halloween movies. I would say out of the original ones, 4 was my favorite, but I do think that the remake is much more enjoyable for me personally than the original. Alright, next opinion. Again, I don't know how controversial this is, but I mean, I don't hear a lot of people talk about it, so here it is. And that is that I think supernatural zombies, you know, like voodoo and like magic zombies and just zombies that are brought back through some sort of unknown supernatural mean, are much more interesting than virus zombies. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The virus zombies, just to me, they're so overdone. You don't see the supernatural zombies as much anymore, where they're just resurrected by some supernatural mean. But the thing I like about supernatural zombies is there is iconic zombie imagery that you just don't see anymore, because every zombie movie has to be a virus zombie now. And that is the hand rising up from the grave. I think that is so cool, the iconic imagery of the graveyard with the corpses rising from the ground. It's just not really a thing anymore. because everything's like, oh, it's a virus, the bodies get back up. And on that note, zombie movies are not my favorite. I'm definitely not as against them as I was for a while. Back when The Walking Dead was in full swing with its popularity, I kind of got burned out on zombies because there were so many zombie movies and they're all just kind of the same. I do have some that are my favorites, and a lot of them are unconventional. As far as the type of zombie, although I do think they are popular movies. Like, my favorite zombie movie is 28 Days Later. I don't think that's an unpopular opinion. I think that's a pretty well-regarded movie. But yeah, I do think that overall supernatural zombies are better, although 28 Days Later is a virus zombie thing, but it takes it in a different direction, so it makes it interesting enough. But I do love that iconic imagery of old-school zombie movies with the hand coming out of the grave. You don't really see that in a whole lot of movies. Alright, next opinion. Friday the 13th on NES is actually a really good game that was ahead of its time. I love Friday the 13th on NES. There are problems with it for sure. It can be very grindy and frustrating at times, but it's got a pretty open world map, and I think it's a better representation of the movies than a lot of people thought it was. Because the whole point is you just gotta kill Jason and survive, and don't let the kids die off, and don't let all your people die off. I think that's pretty representative of what the feel of Friday the 13th. And like, again, the only goal is to kill Jason. You can do it any way you want. It's just very difficult, and it gets easier if you do certain things, like getting the sweater to give you more health, and getting the torch to do more damage. Things like that. I do think that the game gets a lot more hate than it deserves. I absolutely loved it. It's one of my top 10 favorite NES games. It's certainly difficult and frustrating at times, but I absolutely love it. Now on to the next opinion, and this one's a little bit weird because I kind of go back and forth on it. But I do think that House of a Thousand Corpses is a very underrated movie. Maybe that's not the most unpopular opinion, but I would say that this next bit is probably a little bit unpopular. In some cases, I actually think I prefer it over Devil's Rejects. Now, granted, it depends on which watching, because my first time I preferred House of a Thousand Corpses, second time I preferred Devil's Rejects, third time I preferred House of a Thousand Corpses. Like, it goes back and forth. I can't decide which one I like better, because they're both very different movies, and I enjoy them for different reasons. But I do love House of a Thousand Corpses, and in some ways I do like the imagery in it better than Devil's Rejects. Alright, now on to the last opinion, and this is one that I've gone into a few times on the channel. I really fucking hate Nightmare on Elm Street 2. I can't stand Nightmare on Elm Street 2. It's the only one of the original 7 that I don't like, so I think that that does say something. Like, Nightmare on Elm Street 2 is boring and has nothing to do with the rest of the movies. Freddy's in it for like 3 minutes, and then he just possesses the character to just be like, kill for me. But then he doesn't even go on like much of a killing spree. There's very little kills, and don't get me wrong, the kills aren't a deal breaker for me, because New Nightmare doesn't have very many kills either, but I love that one. But I just think that Nightmare on Elm Street 2 Freddy's Revenge is just fucking lame. The acting in it is terrible. There's that one dialogue where that bird explodes and the dad's like, I know what you did, you used a goddamn cherry bomb. And I just remember not liking it compared to the others, because it takes place 5 years after the original, and it takes place in the same house, which is the only real tie back to the original characters. At least in 3, they brought Nancy back and actually started to have the recurring theme where at least one character would carry over to the next movie, and I think that was the problem I had with 2. Because Nightmare on Elm Street is my favorite slasher franchise. I absolutely love it. Freddy's one of my favorite characters in horror. I love him. Fun movies. I hate the remake, but that's not unpopular. Everybody hates the remake. But yeah, I can't stand Nightmare on Elm Street 2. I've watched it multiple times, and I have never enjoyed it anymore each time I've watched it. Most of the time when I'm rewatching the series, I will watch it again, but it's like a chore to get through. So sometimes I'll just skip it. But yeah, that's my unpopular horror opinions. Like I said, kind of rambly, unstructured, whatever. I hope you've enjoyed. This has been Fugitive Red-Eye. Have a good one. Toodles.
Curry sauce all over your anus. Delish.
Looking for cheap thrills, asshole?